Let's learn in this video how to use multiple providers within a Terraform configuration. In Terraform, we typically use one single provider that will point to a specific Azure subscription where we want to deploy our resources. But there are some cases where we need to use multiple providers. Those cases include deploying using multiple identities, to deploying to multiple environments, for example, development, test, and production, and also scenarios like where we want to deploy to multiple Azure subscriptions, where we have subscription A use it for the hub and subscription B use it for the spoke, and then other scenario including the deploying to multiple Azure AD tenants, where an organization might have multiple AD tenants, or it want to include the AD tenants from its partners, for example. So those are the architectures where we typically use the hub and spoke architectures, or when we want to use the enterprise scale landing zone. So how that works? So here I have an example in this sprint screen. So what we have seen here in the left is an example of a Terraform configuration where we use two providers. So we have first provider that will point to a specific subscription, call it subscription hub. It have its own subscription ID, its own tenant ID, and then below we have the subscription for this spoke, where it have its own ID subscription and the tenant ID. Then when I want to deploy resources using Terraform, I should specify for each resource what is the provider that I want to use. And I have here an example for creating two resource groups and two virtual networks. So one for the hub and one for the spoke. So you note here for the resource group, we are creating here, we are providing the provider configuration. So in this case, I'm using the subscription hub, which is the alias that they have defined here. So note here, if I don't define an alias, there will be a default alias created that will have the name default, and that's what we do typically in Terraform. If you don't use multiple providers, you don't need to provide the provider attribute right here. We only use it when we have more than one provider. So first resource group, Azure Hub, will be deployed into the subscription hub, and then the second one, Azure Spoke, will be deployed into the subscription spoke that lives even not just in another Azure subscription, but it also lives into another Azure tenant ID. And then for deploying the hub, so we deployed the hub into an Azure tenant within a subscription, and then we have the spoke virtual network that will be deployed into another subscription and another Azure tenant. So the result of the execution of this Terraform configuration is the following right here, where here when we apply that Terraform configuration, we would see here the deployment will happen into different Azure subscriptions. So you note here we have different Azure subscriptions for the resource, the hub, and for the spoke. Each one is deployed to a different subscription, and we see that here clearly from this print screen. So let's see a demo on how this works clearly. So here I switch to my VS Code, where here I have the configuration for an example here. So I have the configuration for Terraform and then for the providers. So here I'm using the two providers for Azure RM, for example. Note that this doesn't work only for Azure RM, but it works also for other providers. So here I'm specifying subscription hub and subscription spoke. Note here I'm adding also the subscription ID and the tenant ID for each subscription. And then when I want to deploy a resource, so I just use that provider alias for each resource. And then after I have run the Terraform init plan and apply, on the apply you can view the different Azure subscriptions that will be used, the two different ones. And now if I switch to the Azure portal right here, I would see into the two Azure subscriptions here are used within two Azure tenants, and we can view here one subscription with the ID and another one with another ID, and the two resources were deployed into these two different resources. So we can use the multi-provider configuration with Azure RM resources, but we can also use it with Azure AD and almost with any Terraform configuration. So here I have an example with Azure AD, where here I'm specifying a tenant for the hub and another tenant for the spoke with different tenant IDs. And the same principle will apply. So if I want to deploy a resource using Azure AD, I should specify one or the other alias. I hope this demo was helpful for you. If you are looking for the scripts that I have used in this demo and the lab, so you should find it in this GitHub repository. Thank you.